guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I'm here to discuss technology during the Second Industrial Revolution. So yes, this is the Second Industrial Revolution. We are in the 1870s, 1880s, and we're in our second one. So it's really important before I begin to really differentiate between the first and the second industrial revolution. So the first industrial revolution we discussed in period 4, and that happened in the early 1800s. We saw advancements in communication and transportation, like canals and railroads that brought goods to market. We saw inventions like the steel plow and the cotton gin, and ultimately, the first industrial revolution / market revolution centered around a very thriving textile industry. The second industrial revolution is what we're discussing today. Again, while you still have advancements in communication and more railroads with transportation, we are in the late 1800s, and the number one products, if you will, are raw materials. So you're going to see the mass production of raw materials such as steel and oil. You're also going to see a second wave of immigration, which we'll discuss in future chapters, coming into our country, who will be the workforce for a lot of these technological advancements. And we're also going to see the rise of cities as a result. Okay. So as you guys can see here, one of the things I want to start with is where we get our energy from. So we usually define energy as something that either powers things, moves things, or heats things. And as you guys can see for, the large chunk of early American history, power essentially came from wood. But with the mass production of raw materials, we're going to see coal used not only in the steel industry, which I'll discuss, but that'll be powering the railroads. And then we're also going to see the rise of oil, which leads us into natural gas. So a lot of the raw materials that are used during this time are still used today to fuel different elements of the US. As I mentioned, the mass production of raw materials like oil and steel really differentiate the second from the first industrial revolution. And we wouldn't have oil if not for John D. Rockefeller. Now, Mr. Irvin is going to talk about the business practices of two men that I briefly mentioned here, and that's John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. But I just wanted to mention them as I mentioned that oil is something that Rockefeller capitalized on quite a bit. He ended up owning 90% of the oil industry in the United States, and oil becomes a source of energy. Additionally, we are going to see Andrew Carnegie capitalize on the mass production of steel. Now, he wouldn't be able to produce it had it not been for the Bessemer steel process, which basically takes molten iron and essentially inserts air into it. And by doing so, that creates a very durable and cheap material called steel. And that is going to be mass produced by Andrew Carnegie. He doesn't invent it. He just has the capital to sell it, if you will. But it's going to be monumental in building bridges, railroad tracks, and skyscrapers, as you guys see here. Skyscrapers are going to emerge throughout America, and America will no longer build out, they will build up. And as we have more and more Americans and immigrants coming into our major cities, having skyscrapers and taller buildings is going to be instrumental in creating large-scale cities during this time period as well. Now, I know that we've already discussed the telegraph, but I just want to mention the advancements in communication during this time period. Even though Samuel Morse invented the telegraph in 1844, it does become more popular in the 1860s. However, it is limited to one person sending a message to another person, transcribing that message on the other end with Morse code. So the telephone is really the communication advancement during this time period and makes communication far more efficient. Even though several people had the technology to develop the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell is known as its inventor. And while he created and invented it in 1876, it really isn't popularized until the early 1900s when millions of Americans will own their own telephones. He introduced the telephone to the Centennial Exposition in 1876. Honestly, didn't think that many people would be impressed by it, but he was wrong. And 10 years later, over 150,000 telephones were in circulation. He goes on to create the American Telegraph and Telephone Company, also known as AT&T. During this time period, you would pick up your telephone and you would actually speak to a switchboard operator on the other end and let the person know, typically a young woman, who you wanted to be connected to, and she would literally plug your connection into that person. And up until the 1950s, this is how telephone calls were made. Of course, now we just dial them or use voice activation on our cell phones. We've come a really long way. And then, of course, you guys, we have Thomas Edison, who has over 1,000 patents to his name. But in 1879, in his laboratory, which was in Menlo Park, New Jersey, he did not invent the light bulb. He invented the concept of electric lighting. So he was able to experiment with multiple types of plants and cardboard and like different materials to create a filament to put into a light bulb to allow it to last for several hours. And with that experimentation, electric lighting was born. Now, this is today's electric power grid. Obviously, it's much heavier around major cities. But if you think about having electricity during this time period, you know, most people before the concept of electric lighting worked from sunup to sundown. They were powered by daylight hours. This is going to allow factories and businesses to work well into the evening. This is going to allow, you know, homes to stay up later and have dinner. And so it's really going to change the way Americans live and work during this time period. There are some other notable inventions like typewriters, obviously replacing, you know, handwritten letters. You've got cameras to capture those beautiful images. And the last one I want to talk about is the rise of a mail order catalog. So this might be a foreign concept to some of you guys because we can just, you know, get on our phones and order something on Amazon Prime and it's here in 2 days, right? But back in the day, if you did not live in a major metropolitan area and you didn't have the means to maybe go into a department store, you could actually order items out of a catalog. And Sears, Roebuck and Company was the first to put out catalogs, although there were many companies that did the same. And it would be mailed to your house and you open it up. And as you guys can see here, you can, you know, get a banjo for $2. You could buy guns, you could buy clothing. It pretty much had anything you could think of. And then you'd place your order and then those items would be delivered to your house. And they would be delivered, going back to Mr. Brigham's video, as a result of the railroads. So the railroads were really instrumental in allowing these companies to ship products to their customers. Obviously, Sears is a company that's still around today. And even catalogs. I remember growing up as a kid in the 80s and ordering things out of catalogs. They were still very popular up until, you know, the maybe late 80s, early 90s and the invention of the internet. So that takes us through some technological advancements. Hope you guys have a